That's what this statute is. It's a $10 fine if you don't produce a license. So if you leave it at home or you know, you left it at work, or if you lost it, it's a $10 traffic offense. In order for that infraction to apply, the officer has to be in uniform and badge of authority. And the only thing that this bill does is says that before you're required to produce your license and registration, so you don't have to pay $10 in court, is the officer has to tell you why they stopped you. That's all it does. So the officer said, pulled you over for speeding, pulled you over for not using your turn signal, wearing badge and authority. You don't produce it, you pay $10. I think it's a very minor bill, but I also think it will help to lower the steam in traffic encounters with law enforcement. When people are stopped and they don't know the reason why they were stopped, they often want to know that, and when an officer doesn't tell them, it creates tension.
Madam President, I think I'm the only one that's ever probably done a traffic stop, maybe besides Senator Cosgrove in his auxiliary capacity. I will tell you there's nothing more scary than walking up to a car that's a bolo car from a violent crime by yourself, trying to figure out who's in the car and what's happened. I think what you're asking officers to do here is a safety issue as well. And if you're expecting them to walk up to the car and say exactly why they stopped them, I don't think that's reasonable to put on an officer, because most officers I know are going to stop them and ask for license and registration. They're going to check the demeanor of the driver to find out the state, if they're inebriated, if they're high, what they're going to take into a lot of circumstances to that stop. And I will tell you that if it's stopped not for a traffic infraction, but something else that was put out on a lookout, we'll say, it's even more heightened. And so I think the biggest thing here is that we're just putting another barrier between the police and our people that we try to take care of. And I think we're going to have a real problem, Madam President, within a reasonable time. I can see these cases coming of being argued in court about what is considered reasonable and how long people had to sit there till they can confirm the identity of the driver and the vehicles. And I think I have written this. Actual, where's your driver's license and registration? Those tickets are normally null prost, as long as the driver shows you by the time you go to court, or they show you sometime prior to going to court that they did have a driver's license. Usually the police officer will go to the Commonwealth attorney and say, hey, they didn't have it on them. And people will be honest with you. But there are a lot of people who don't have driver's license, Madam President, or their licenses are suspended, or they're driving as a habitual driver, or whatever it is. And you've just uncovered something else. And so, I understand what the patron's getting at. I think it seems simple on its face, but I think there's a lot more to it.
There have been numerous instances just in this year where traffic stops, a police officer has come up to the window and has been shot and killed. Now, I don't think it is an overreach to ask somebody for the necessary documents that they must have in order to be driving a motor vehicle in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, whether you de-escalate the situation by telling them why you stopped, I can't say that will or won't happen. But asking them for the required documentation is not an overreach.
First of all, if you're doing a BOLO stop, a be on the lookout stop, you don't need to ask somebody. You don't need to comply with this statute unless you want to charge that person with a $10 offense. You can conduct the stop any other way you want, complies with the Constitution, but you don't have to advise them the reason for the stop unless you really, 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 really want to charge them that $10 infraction, which I've actually seen charged, by the way, in my 24 years of practicing. Maybe the senator from James City County hasn't seen it, but I have. Not often, as I said, but it is charged. Number one. Number two, in terms of my secret agenda here, I want to talk about that a little bit. This situation arose, I decided to try and put a bill in about this situation because of a situation I had involving a constituent. And I had a bill drafted. It was different than this. It was entitled 18.2. I circulated it to law enforcement because I've been working with them a lot lately over the last 3 years. And I had a dialogue with them. And the feedback I got back said, this is a better solution. We like this better. Why don't you go put it here? And so I put the bill in this statute. I put the language in this statute. And I brought it to committee. And before I testified, I saw that there were some law enforcement reps out in the crowd, and I walked up to them and I said, y'all have any issue with my bill? And they said, no. Now, I appreciate there's some retired law enforcement that may have a different view than all of the law enforcement representatives that give us feedback in committee, but apparently none of them had a problem with the bill because it doesn't really do much, which is the point. Now, in terms of the de-escalation piece, I can appreciate that for some folks, being stopped by a police officer doesn't give you a lot of concern. You know, when I drive my car, I'm not always the best driver, but when I see law enforcement behind me, I typically don't get nervous. Other people don't process it that way. Other people have different experiences. And other people, when they see law enforcement, get nervous. And for my constituent, she was stopped at 2 in the morning on the Washington Capitol Beltway, about 5 minutes from her home, and she couldn't figure out why she was stopped. Apparently, the trooper thought her lights were off, but she had running lights. And when he stopped her, she said, "Why are you stopping me?" And he wouldn't tell her. And when he wouldn't tell her, all that did was escalate the situation. And they started going back and forth and back and forth. The whole thing's on video. Resulted in my constituent being dragged from her car and arrested for drunk driving. She was taken back to the adult detention center and put on a breathalyzer, and her breath alcohol content came back at a whopping 0.0%. The charges ended up being dropped. And if her and that trooper had simply had a dialogue on the side of the road, I thought your lights were off. And she said, no, I have running lights. You know what? It never would have happened. It never would have happened. And I thought this was a very simple, very minor, very elegant solution suggested by law enforcement to solve what is an increasing problem in light of what's been going on in this country. This doesn't create some new suppression motion. There's no language in here that says the whole case gets thrown out if you don't tell somebody why they're stopped. It's really a very minor bill, and I'm really disappointed it devolved into this because it doesn't do what it's being portrayed to do, and I would really hope we pass it.
That being said,